Well, good morning, and welcome. Happy solstice, happy summer, happy heat dome. Every year we get a new weather term, don't we? Polar vortex and the heat dome and training and all the different interesting things. So the title of our talk is What Happened to Reality? And I chose that title because I've heard several people say that over the past several weeks in one way or another. What happened to reality? Where'd it go? Well, the answer is nothing happened to reality. Reality is exactly the same as it's always been. However, normality has changed considerably. Okay? So there's a difference between normality and reality. Big difference. Typically, our culture will tell us what normality is. Tells us what's the way to behave and what's the way things should be and how to do this and how to say that and what the proper attire is and the proper words are, etc., etc. That's dictated by our culture. But it's so ingrained in us that we kind of mistaken it for reality. Can't tell you how many times I've heard people say to me at the end of the retreat, a retreat, 4 or 5 day retreat, week-long retreat. Well, tomorrow I got to go back to reality. My response usually is, you've been in reality, or you've hopefully been finding reality. And hopefully you're not leaving it. But oftentimes we do. We leave reality to be normal, don't we? We do that at a very young age. We abandon our reality for our cultural dictate of what's normal. Because the culture says you've got to be normal. Even though today there's not much definition for normal anymore. When I was growing up, there was a very clear and rigid definition of what normal meant. So today I want to talk about culture and its impact on us and how we can relate wisely to a culture that's rapidly changing and in many ways in a deep crisis. I want to start out by saying what the ego is to the individual, culture is to the collective. So the culture is the collective ego, if you will. The ego is the way we structure our internal sense of self. I don't say we do it. It was structured for us. We perpetuate it. And culture is the way that reality appears to us through a particular lens of our conditioning. Ego, literally, means I. Ego is the Latin word for I, or me. Culture means, not literally, but culture refers to we. So there's the me and there's the we. The me is the ego, the we is the culture. So there's me vis-a-vis you, and there's we vis-a-vis them. So there's a dividing line we draw. Now we don't do that consciously, that's programmed into us. But the very fact that a child raised in an English-speaking family will speak English and not Chinese. We don't have to teach children how to speak. They learn. They learn it through osmosis, if you will. Well, believe me, that's not the only thing they learn. They learn everything. Body language, and they learn more than we realize, more than we even know that we're teaching our children. And that's just the way it is. There's no way around that. It's not bad, it's not good. The culture is programmed into the ego via the family. So the family is kind of a conduit from the culture to the individual. Now we have subcultures, of course, depending upon our race, ethnicity, religion, geographic area, whatever you say. We have different subcultures. But for the most part, we live in a relatively cohesive culture. The common denominator typically being language. It's not the only thing. But culture becomes so automatic. Sometimes culture is called the second nature. Second nature for human beings, because it's sometimes difficult to even separate nature from culture, conditioning from what's natural or normal. I remember hearing a story, sad story, from several years ago, when the American military was active in Iraq, i.e. when we invaded that country. And there was a military checkpoint. The MPs were manning that checkpoint. An Iraqi family came up in their automobile. And the MP stepped out of the shed and stood in front of the sign and put his hand up like this. Well, the car kept on coming, went right past. They're yelling at them. Of course, they don't speak English. Halt, halt. Finally, they shot him, which was their protocol. But in that particular culture, the culture of this family, I don't know if it's true of all of Iraqi culture, this means welcome. Okay? Now you and I, we instinctively go like this. Really, it's not instinctive, but we're trained to go like that. That's the culture says this. And they see that and they welcome, well, thank you. You see? So just a simple yet tragic example of how when cultures clash, we realize how deep these nuances are. So a huge part of our practice is being aware of how we are enculturated, how we are impacted by our culture, and how we can consciously relate to our culture. And if we choose to maybe change it or influence it, that's optional. But we live in our culture the same way a fish lives in the ocean. When we're outside of our culture, we're like a fish outside the water, flopping around, looking for something familiar. Our culture tells us what's true, what's real, tells us what's of value, what's important, what's not of value, what's appropriate, behavior, dress, action, what things mean, the significance of things, such as this. And even more so, there's these deep assumptions built into our psyche. It's often called the worldview. The worldview is not just what you see when you look out your window, but your worldview is how you structure reality, how you see reality. You know, our worldview today is very, very, very different than, say, the worldview of someone living in China 1,000 years ago, or 2,500 years ago living in India. The worldview is very, very different. The cultural assumptions are very different. At the time of the Buddha, why reincarnation was as natural as what? Breathing for us, I guess, you know. It was just part of the culture. And so on and so forth. So cultural difference is very important. And really, what shapes culture probably more than anything, and it's both a reflection of culture and a shaper of culture, and that's language. You see, we don't just speak in language, we think in language. And we don't just think in language, we actually perceive in language. You know, if I were to ask you to look around, I'd say, what do your eyes see? You would say, oh, I see people, I see men, I see women, I see chairs, I see the floor. Your eye doesn't see that. The eye sees colors, sees shapes, maybe movement. That's what the eye sees. The mind sees chairs and people, and men and women, adults, children, white people, black people, tall people, short people. That's what the mind sees. In our language, the language is structured such as somebody does something, perhaps to someone or something. You know, the dog bit Susie. Johnny ran fast. Okay, somebody does something. So there's a noun, a thing, and then there's an action, and perhaps an action upon something else, or just an action. You know, the dog barked. we hear a barking dog. We think the dog is barking. We think the dog is choosing to bark. Maybe to make me angry. But we see things in terms of objects. That's not necessarily reality. But that's a very, very deep assumption in our culture because of our language. Because the language says that somebody has to do something. Even when things just happen. You know, like rain. When there's rain outside, we say, hey, it's raining. Have you ever asked, what is it that's raining? It's raining. The word it is superfluous, right? But we need to say it because something has to do something. Nothing happens by itself because our language demands it. Yes, sir. And like our parents used to say to us, things don't just happen. One of you did it. No, it just happened. You know, maybe it did. But we don't see in terms of flow. We don't see in terms of process. We don't see in terms of relationship. We see things doing things to other things. And that's the structure in part of our language and in part of the way we have created reality. And part of that is our own physiology as well as our language. So our culture is in the midst of a rapid and deep change. That's impacting all of us. You know, I could read a long list and probably not be totally inclusive of all of the changes there that are happening. You know, the pandemic shook everything up, turned everything upside down, didn't it? You know, we have gender fluidity. When I was a kid, I never heard of gender fluidity, did you? You know, what gender are you? Oh, I don't know. Today I think I'm just open. There were 2 boxes on the forms. Now there's a whole string of boxes. Artificial intelligence. I mean, that's one that we can't even get our head around right now. But artificial intelligence is just in its incipiency. That will have a huge impact on our culture. Enormous. Of course, social media already has and probably will continue to be so. You know, this leads to globalism, the fact that we can communicate with somebody on the other side of the planet just as well as we can, maybe easier than talk to the person next door. There may be a bigger divide between my next door neighbor and me than there is between me and somebody in China. So our culture, our world is being redefined. And we're in the midst of a huge flux in its creating, obviously, political divisions. It's creating stresses and strains in our schools. I understand teachers are quitting at a record rate. It's really sad. You know, all parts of our society are impacted by what's going on. And whenever there's a deep change taking place, typically humans react in one of two ways. You either want to go backward or you want to jump forward. Let's go back to the way it was, or let's get it over with. The hardest thing is probably the wisest thing. I don't know what's going to happen. Let's just stay present. Let's stay present to the unknown rather than trying to push it forward or pull it backwards. So, but that's where we get into these arguments between regression and going forward. Culture is not reality. Culture obscures reality. Culture puts us into a trance, just as the ego does. The ego is a miniature culture. It keeps us in a trance. So as we become more aware of our culture, as we become more aware of how we have been enculturated, and as we become more aware of how we can consciously relate to, live in our culture, that's a very important part of the Dharma practice. Extremely important part. Because the Buddha did not have to deal with globalism, social media, gender fluidity, etc., etc. Same principles, but it's much more complex. So we're called upon to be more deeply aware. And we're called upon to be in the world, but not of it. And that's really the intention of this practice, is not to drop out of the world. Most of us are not monastics. Most of us are what would be called householders. We live in the world. I want to close with this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says, "It's easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It's easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It's easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great person is one who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude." That's what I call autonomy. Autonomy is not rebelling, it's not pushing back. Because when we're pushing back, fighting, we're still identified with it. But autonomy is recognizing it's there and choosing whether or not you want to respond in a certain way. So, I think I'll stop with this because we're just about out of time. Our culture dictates that we need to finish by 10 o'clock or thereabouts. So, thank you for your practice. Good to see you here this morning.